Why would you ever try to land an aircraft from a crazy approach like this? Well, when you're flying a route that you've flown loads of times before, it's easy to just kind of relax and maybe drop your guard a bit. But sometimes these familiar scenarios can turn into something completely new, and if you aren't careful then, these easy approaches can turn into something really, really dangerous. Stay tuned. Southwest Airlines is right now the fourth largest airline in the United States, and it's also known as the largest Boeing 737 operator in the world. Over its more than 50-year history, Southwest has almost exclusively operated 737s, and today it has a fleet with over 800 of them flying. One of those was the one used in this story, a classic Boeing 737-300, registered as November 668 Sierra Whiskey. And on the 5th of March 2000, it had been scheduled to operate the late afternoon flight 1455 from Las Vegas, Nevada, over to Burbank International Airport in Southern California. This was not a very long flight, just about an hour and 15 minutes from gate to gate, and it was also a route which the pilots scheduled to operate on this day were very familiar with. In command was a 52-year-old captain who had extensive previous experience in both the Air Force, corporate jets and, of course, passenger airliners, and he had been working for Southwest Airlines since 1988. On this day, he had around 11,000 flying hours in total, almost all of which had been flown on the Boeing 737, and his colleagues described him as an average pilot with a friendly, easygoing attitude. Joining him in the cockpit was a 43-year-old first officer who had been with Southwest for a little over 3 years at this point, after having previously spent 12 years with the US Air Force. He had about 5,000 total hours, of which almost exactly half were on the Boeing 737, and he was described as an above-average pilot by captains who had flown with him. He was also active in the Air Force Reserves, where he occasionally still flew the F-16, something that he had actually done as recently as 2 days before this story began. Both pilots had been off duty for quite a while before this flight, which was to be the first of a 3-day, 5-flight trip sequence together. And the captain also lived in Las Vegas, so he was likely feeling quite well rested as the day began. This would have been a bread and butter flight for these pilots, but especially for the captain who had been flying between Las Vegas and Burbank dozens, if not hundreds of times during his career so far. But a couple of aspects of the flight on this day were just slightly different than usual. You see, despite Las Vegas' famously hot and dry weather, the weather at the city's McCarran International Airport was on this day quite volatile, with thunderstorms reported near the field and all along the route over towards Burbank. The thunderstorms had even triggered a wind shear warning at the airport, which was a very rare thing in Las Vegas. Now, this region of bad weather was also affecting Southern California, and as it turned out, the aircraft that was later supposed to operate Flight 1455 had been delayed on the ground in Los Angeles for almost 2 hours due to these storms. As a result, the pilots arrived at McCarran Airport to find that the plane they were supposed to use wasn't there yet, and their scheduled departure time of 14:45 came and went, with no sign of the aircraft turning up. So when the plane actually finally arrived at the time 16:30, the pilots and crew hurriedly boarded their passengers and ran through the pre-flight checks to try and save up some time, and they managed to do so very, very quickly. Actually, by time 16:50, after having boarded all 137 passengers and 3 flight attendants, Flight 1455 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing towards the runway, only 20 minutes after the plane had first arrived to the gate. And as a fellow 737 pilot, I can attest to that being very fast. As the pilots completed their performance calculations, they had noted that the airplane was unusually heavy, despite the short flight and relatively normal passenger load. And the exact reason for this extra weight aren't clearly explained in the accident report, but 3,000 extra pounds of fuel had been added beyond the normal quantity in order to allow the plane to fly all the way back to Las Vegas if it couldn't land in Burbank. So that likely accounted for it. Now, this extra fuel would also mean that the aircraft would be close to its maximum allowed landing weight when it arrived to their destination, and that's worth keeping in mind. Anyway, after having taxied out to the runway, Flight 1455 soon received its takeoff clearance, and the pilots executed a normal takeoff with the captain as pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring. The climb phase was then completely uneventful, and they soon reached their cruising altitude, leveled off, and started heading southwest over the Mojave Desert. Whilst en route, the pilots requested deviations around a couple of thunderstorms, and the flight experienced some mild turbulence, but nothing that posed any real difficulty for the crew. Now, we routinely avoid thunderstorms en route, and our weather radar is more than capable of detecting these cells to allow us to avoid them, so this would not have been in any way bothering for the crew. After less than an hour, the pilots then requested and initiated their initial descent, during which time the cockpit voice recorder captured them chatting about their careers and about a United Airlines flight that had nearly struck terrain after takeoff from San Francisco back in 1988, something that was now being used as a training scenario in the airline. They also talked about the situation they were expecting to encounter once they started approaching Burbank, and to understand what the pilots thought lay ahead of them, I want to talk a little bit more about this particular airport. Hollywood Burbank is a domestic airport located about 18 kilometers north of downtown Los Angeles, in the southeastern corner of the San Fernando Valley. It is wedged in quite close to some high terrain, including a mountain that rises to 3,000 feet immediately east of the field, as well as the Hollywood Hills, a short distance to the south, who reaches a height of 1,700 feet. It has two runways, runway 0826 aligned from west to east, and runway 1533 which runs from northwest to southeast. Now, due to the terrain restrictions I just mentioned, only runway 08 had an instrument landing system, an ILS, and the vast majority of traffic flying into Burbank tended to land on that runway. The reciprocal runway 26 was very difficult for airliners to use due to the high hills just 3 nautical miles from the threshold, so if the tailwinds were too strong to land on runway 08, then runway 33 was usually used instead. By the time the CVR recording started, the pilots were already aware of a reported 18-knot tailwind on runway 08, so the captain commented that they would probably need to land on runway 33, since he couldn't even recall ever using runway 26. Moments later, he then also gave a quick briefing, in which he anticipated a visual approach to runway 33 that they would use flap 40, and also repeated the local altimeter setting. Then, at time 1802, the flight crew were handed over from the previous controller to the woodland sector of the so-called TRACON, a massive combined air traffic control facility that funnels traffic into numerous airports throughout the Los Angeles area. Immediately after establishing contact, the woodland controller told Flight 1455 to expect an ILS approach to runway 08, which, like I mentioned, was the default instrument approach into Burbank. This approach was much more familiar to the pilots than the visual approach that they had just briefed, so that likely meant that, in the captain's eyes at least, the task ahead of him had now just gotten way easier. But like I've already said, nothing about this flight had been exactly normal so far, from the weather to the weight to the fast turnaround, and as we will soon see, the notion that this would be a normal approach was also misguided. Now, I mentioned the short briefing that the pilots had made before, and I just cannot overemphasize just how important accurate briefings are for the shared situational awareness. And that's actually true for everyone, no matter what industry that you're in. But the problem is that long briefings and business meetings can be hard to accurately keep detailed track of, and you don't want to miss something important because you're focusing on taking notes. That's where today's sponsor, Plaud Note, comes in. This amazing little device is essentially a physical AI secretary who records, organizes and transcribes everything that you need. That also means that you won't need those awkward virtual AI pop-ups on your online meetings anymore. You just press this little button here and it starts working for you. You can also record your phone calls if you pop it on the back of the phone. See, like that. And that works amazingly well for business calls or anything important, really. Plaud are also just about to launch a new, even more powerful app in early October, where on top of recording, you can also add pictures and mark key points during a meeting, which will enable Plaud to generate highly detailed sets of meeting notes. That includes summary highlights, to-dos, and even to identify people's underlying intentions and the conversation dynamics. It is really, really cool. Now, Plaud can record for 30 hours straight and translate conversations into over 100 languages. And since it's supported by GPT 4.0, you can then also ask it questions, search recordings, and even connect it to other work apps. So if you would like to try this, then scan this QR code or go to the link in the description or the comment section below. Just remember to use my code, Mentour10, for a 10% discount at checkout. Thank you, Plaud, for sponsoring this video. Now, where were we? Yes. Flight 1455 was now located around 21 nautical miles north of the threshold of runway 08, southwest from the Palmdale VOR radio beacon and following the normal arrival route. As inbound traffic reaches this area, the Woodland sector controller normally gives them radar vectors to intercept the runway 08 approach at a distance of between 10 to 15 nautical miles from the runway threshold. ATC procedures required the controller to provide vectors that would result in an intercept angle of 30 degrees or less, basically so that the flight crew wouldn't have to turn so sharply to intercept the final approach, since that could lead to them overshooting. This usually also meant that the controller would send aircraft quite far to the west before vectoring them back in for a more shallow intercept, although occasionally a steeper intercept angle closer to the runway was being used. The exact vectors given by air traffic control during this phase varied somewhat depending on the traffic situation, because the controller's job also included to sequence aircraft out by keeping them at a certain distance apart from each other, using whatever means they had at their disposal. That could mean giving some flights longer or shorter vectors, but could also mean issuing speed restrictions intended to prevent faster aircraft from catching up to slower, or just to extend the distance between them. In this case, a different Southwest aircraft, Flight 1713, was ahead of Flight 1455 and had received vectors to intercept the approach course about 12 nautical miles away from the runway. At the same time, a business jet was also coming in from the northwest, but it was still quite far out, so the controller's plan was to slot Flight 1455 in ahead of it, basically between these two flights. But if the controller vectored Flight 1455 too far to the west before turning them inbound, the business jet would catch up. So he now decided to instead start vectoring the flight early, beginning at time 1803 with a left turn to 190 degrees and a descent down to 6,000 feet. The first officer acknowledged this, and the pilots then started the descending turn, which would take them towards a more southwesterly direction. But just 30 seconds later, the controller also instructed Flight 1455 to maintain an airspeed of 230 knots or greater until advised. Now, keeping Flight 1455 at a speed of 230 knots would increase the distance between that flight and the business jet behind them, which was flying at 210 knots. But in hindsight, this probably wasn't even necessary, because the controller was also about to give Flight 1455 a shortcut. Now, these kinds of speed restrictions are super common on approaches to busy airports, so the pilots likely weren't surprised at all by receiving one. They just acknowledged the restriction and then carried on. But the combination of keeping a higher speed than normal, being heavy, and receiving shortcuts is a tricky combo, as we will soon see. As they continued, the first officer also calculated that their approach reference speed, or VREF, should be 133 knots at their current weight, and since the new weather report mentioned a 6-knot tailwind, company policy was to fly the approach at VREF plus 5 knots, which would mean 138 knots in total. That meant that they now had to lose almost 100 knots between their position they were now at on the downwind and the final approach. But the controller didn't say how long this speed restriction would last, so it was unclear how much time the pilots would have to decelerate. Seconds later, though, the controller cleared them to descend to 5,000 feet and to turn left onto a southeasterly heading of 160 degrees. This new heading puts the aircraft on a course to intercept the approach track at just under 8 nautical miles from the runway threshold, which was unusually close. In fact, this clearance cut about 6 miles from the expected approach track that the pilots had in mind, which meant that the separation between Flight 1455 and the business jet behind them now increased by that same amount. That effectively eliminated any need for that 230 knot speed restriction, but for whatever reason the controller just forgot to cancel it. Now at this point, the pilots should have recognized that they were in a position where it might not be possible to stabilize the approach, so they should have reported unable to this clearance and asked for more track miles, or at least to get free speed. But that didn't happen. And to understand why, I want to talk about 2 things here. 1, the stabilized approach concept, and 2, Southwest Airlines company culture at the time. You see, every airline around the world uses the stabilized approach concept to ensure that approaches are only continued to a landing if all parameters are indicating that it's safe to do so. Under this concept, pilots are taught that the approach is stabilized if the aircraft is fully configured for landing, with all flight parameters within a narrow optimal range when reaching the stabilization gate, which is generally at 1,000 feet on an instrument approach or 500 feet on a visual approach. Southwest Airlines used the term "in the slot" to refer to the stabilized approach parameters, which in their case meant being on the glide path with the airspeed within 10 knots of the calculated approach speed, a descent rate of less than 1,000 feet per minute, flaps and gear extended, thrust levels in the correct position, and no major control inputs needed to maintain the glide path and runway alignment. The idea was that if the approach didn't meet all of those requirements at the gate, the pilot should then execute a missed approach. But back in the early 2000s, these kind of rules had gotten a little bit, shall we say, stretched at Southwest Airlines. You see, at the time, Southwest performed a very high rate of visual approaches, basically encouraging its pilots to do so whenever the weather permitted, which in the southwestern US was most of the time. Now, visual approaches can be harder to stabilize due to the lack of automatic course guidance and higher workload, but they often also save time and fuel versus carrying out a full instrument approach, which is something that Southwest was very conscious of. Now, because of this difficulty, it wasn't uncommon for Southwest pilots to find that 1 or 2 of those parameters weren't quite in the slot at the stabilization gate, which then should have resulted in a go-around. But instead, most pilots just corrected these parameters below 500 feet and then landed the airplane. Part of the reason for this happening was that Southwest procedures didn't clearly state when exactly a missed approach had to be performed. Most documents just said something like, if you are not in the slot, you are not prepared for a normal landing, but didn't specify that a missed approach had to be flown. At the same time, many Southwest pilots had also begun to judge whether they were in the slot on a visual approach based on what the runway looked like, if it looked right to them, instead of strictly cross-checking all of the required parameters. But making the decision to land based on whether they subjectively believed that they were in a position to make it was obviously totally contrary to the purpose of the stabilized approach concept. An independent review of Southwest's company culture would later reveal that these issues were part of a broader trend in which pilots at the airline were encouraged to complete any approach from which a landing was judged to be possible, regardless of whether it was a good idea or not. Southwest culture was also found to emphasize a fast pace of operations, often featuring hot and high slam-dunk approaches to save time and fuel. And many Southwest pilots even believed that making aggressive visual approaches under very challenging circumstances was a way to develop and maintain good piloting skills. Now, I want to be clear here and say that Southwest wasn't the only airline during that time that encouraged that kind of mindset. But it is also true that this kind of culture increased the level of risk by encouraging pilots to practice difficult scenarios with passengers on board. Now, these kind of challenging approaches can indeed help keep skills sharp, but in general, it's better to confine this type of practice to the simulator so as not to endanger paying passengers, who I can guarantee would not vote for their flight being more risky than absolutely necessary. I would also like to add that this behavior exemplifies one of what we in aviation call the 5 hazardous attitudes, specifically the attitude known as macho. Macho means an I can do it attitude, with a tendency to show off or a need to prove oneself in the eyes of others, sometimes by taking risks or completing difficult challenges. According to that independent review that I mentioned before, Southwest Airlines also didn't do enough to mitigate the risks of this operating style, because its training program failed to include adequate techniques for managing the aircraft's energy state during visual approaches, and it also didn't emphasize the need to properly brief those approaches. Try to remember both of those points, because they are going to become quite relevant soon. Back on board flight 1455, the pilots now accepted the new heading of 160 degrees, and the captain reminded the first officer that the controller wanted 230 knots or greater for a while. Neither pilot considered asking ATC for more track miles, which actually is another thing that the independent review pointed out, that Southwest pilots were reluctant to respond to air traffic control that they were unable to complete the clearance, which is also a classic macho trait. Anyway, after a little less than a minute, the controller again called up flight 1455 to mention the presence of flight 1713, which was now at their 1 o'clock position 12 miles out, turning inbound towards the approach and descending out of 4,600 feet. The controller also asked if they would like to make a visual approach to runway 08 instead of an ILS approach, and the first officer asked the captain if they should take that offer, provided that they could get the traffic in sight. At the time, the aircraft was still in a layer of clouds, but they expected to break out into visual conditions quite soon, so the captain told the first officer that they would have to wait and see if they could do that. Over the next minute, the pilots told the cabin crew to prepare for arrival, while a traffic control informed them that flight 1713 was now over Van Nuys at 3,000 feet. Van Nuys is a major single-runway general aviation airport located 6 nautical miles west of the approach end of Burbank's runway 08. This airport presents an obstacle to Burbank arrival since it's one of the busiest general aviation airports in the world, with more than 230,000 annual aircraft movements, quite a lot more than Burbank itself, in fact. The Van Nuys VOR, located at the north end of the field, was a major landmark on the runway 08 approach, and the minimum altitude over that beacon was set at 3,000 feet in order to keep airliners above the Van Nuys traffic pattern. Now, the approach path of runway 08 actually crosses over the southern tip of Van Nuys runway, but airliners approaching Burbank can still descend below 3,000 feet there, provided that they're performing an instrument approach, because separation from the ILS glide slope is baked into Van Nuys traffic procedures. Anyway, flight 1455 now broke through the clouds, and the first officer announced that they could see Van Nuys airport ahead of them. Seconds later, the captain called out that he had flight 1713 in sight, and the first officer reported this to the air traffic controller, who in response cleared flight 1455 for a visual approach to runway 08 with a restriction to cross Van Nuys at 3,000 feet or above, since they now weren't using an instrument landing system approach. But that instruction was a little bit ambiguous, because the official definition of an altitude restriction states that it is an altitude to be maintained until a specific point or time. But no specific endpoint was given here, since they wouldn't end up flying over Van Nuys. A strict interpretation of this clearance might mean that they could begin descending from 3,000 feet as soon as they passed a beam, the Van Nuys VOR, but this probably wasn't what the controller meant. On the other hand, the captain later told investigators that he wanted to stay well clear of the general aviation traffic, so he interpreted this clearance to mean that they could descend from 3,000 feet only after leaving the airspace immediately around Van Nuys airport. But if they waited that long to descend, well then they would end up well above the glide path, forcing them to play catch up by then descending really quickly, which would make it hard or even impossible to bleed off their excess speed. Now, all of this could have been solved by just asking the controller to clarify what he meant, or even better, to ask for a wider pattern. But that didn't happen. Now, because Southwest pilots did visual approaches whenever possible, it's likely that being above the glide path at this point due to the altitude restrictions over Van Nuys was completely normal for these pilots. And it's also worth pointing out that the 230 knot speed restriction had technically been cancelled by the crew receiving an approach clearance, but the controller never explicitly highlighted that. In fact, the captain didn't appear to realize that they were free to slow down until almost a full minute after the approach clearance had been issued, by which time the flight was located 2 nautical miles abeam Van Nuys to the west. At that point, the captain extended the speed brake to start slowing down, while also beginning the left turn to align with the runway 4 final approach. Now, the autopilot was still engaged at this point, and the pilots had tuned the frequency for the ILS localizer in order to help them align automatically. So, as they approached the centerline, the autopilot now started trying to capture the localizer. But because the controller had vectored them with such a tight intercept angle, the autopilot was now unable to do this in a clean way and instead ended up overshooting the centerline to the right before starting to correct back to the left over the southern end of Van Nuys. After regaining the approach centerline, the captain instructed the first officer to set flaps 5, the very first step in configuring the aircraft for landing. And as a reference here, in my airline, the aircraft have to be configured with a minimum of flaps 1, at least 10 nautical miles away from the runway, and with the speed back to around 180 knots or so. But this aircraft were nowhere near that speed, and they were much closer. Shortly after this overshoot intercept, the Woodland controller gave them the frequency for Burbank Tower and then handed them over to receive their landing clearance. The captain now ordered the landing gear to be extended, which the first officer also did, and the captain then disconnected the autopilot and assumed manual control, adding workload to this already complex situation. The first officer, meanwhile, called up Burbank Tower and reported that they were on a visual approach to runway 08, and in response to that, the tower informed them that the wind was now 210 degrees at 6 knots and then cleared them to land with a 6-knot tailwind. It was only now, with the plane located just 3 nautical miles from the threshold, that the captain started their final descent from 3,000 feet. And taking into account the airport elevation of 720 feet, this meant that to land in the touchdown zone, they would have to achieve a descent flight path angle of 7 degrees, which is more than twice the normal approach angle. Losing that much altitude that quickly would also cause the airspeed to increase quite a lot, since the pilots would have to pitch down to do so. So from this point, it was probably physically impossible to decelerate to their calculated approach speed before reaching the runway. So this was the point at which the pilots should have definitely have realized that it would not be possible to stabilize this approach, and therefore they should have just executed a nice and calm go-around. But instead, without discussing their precarious position at all, the captain just continued the approach, calling for flaps 15 and flaps 25 in quick succession. Around this time, he also glanced down onto his flight management display, which shows some performance data, and noticed that they had a 20-knot tailwind, which was way more than the 6 knots that was reported on the ground. The captain thought that this high tailwind must be why they had to use such a high descent rate, because the tailwind was causing a higher than normal ground speed. But in reality, their very high airspeed to begin with was the main cause of this problem. You see, while the captain was probably used to starting the descent at this point, he wasn't used to doing it at such a high speed, which requires a higher descent rate to achieve the glide path due to the decreased time available. If he would have been fully configured and back at his approach speed here, this might still have been possible, but in the situation that they were now in, it was not. The captain found this confusing at first, but the tailwind now gave him a convenient explanation, and that tailwind was going to die down. This also caused him to conclude that the solution was to descend even quicker into the area closer to the ground where the tailwind was indeed less strong. So, flying manually, he now eyeballed the trajectory he would need in order to reach the runway and then put the airplane into a very steep descent. Seconds later, the Ground Proximity Warning System, the GPWS, detected an unsafe ground closure rate, causing an automated voice to call out
"Sink rate, sink rate,"
several times. But interestingly, neither pilot acknowledged this caution. Instead, The captain just said, "Flaps 30, just put it down." 3 seconds later, he then also added, "Put it to 40. It won't go, I know that, it's all right. Final descent checklist." What he meant here was that they were actually flying above the flap limit speed for flaps 40. You see, every flap setting has a speed limit associated with it, above which using that flap setting could cause damage to the flap mechanisms. For this reason, the Boeing 737 has a flap load limiting system that doesn't allow the flaps to extend to flaps 40 degrees unless the airspeed is below 158 knots. And since the captain knew that they were above that speed, he also knew that the flaps wouldn't actually reach 40 degrees until they had decelerated below it. In later interviews, the captain said that he knew that they were too fast, but couldn't recall what their actual airspeed was. But according to the flight data recorder, it was still around a terrifying 200 knots at this point, and it wasn't really decreasing at all due to the high descent angle. This meant that flight 1455 was now descending on a very steep glide path with
Sink rate.
the alerts blaring and 60 knots above the approach reference speed. So, where was the first officer in all of this? As the pilot monitoring, it was his responsibility to call out deviations from the stabilized approach parameters and also to suggest corrective actions, which in this case would have been to just execute the go-around. But he didn't. He later explained that he had heard the sink rate alerts and had seen their high altitude and speed, but he consciously decided not to call this out because, in his opinion, the captain was aware and already correcting. Now, the problem with that mindset is that as pilot monitoring, he was required to make those call-outs, regardless of whether he thought that the captain was aware of the problem or not. Obviously, the first officer couldn't be inside the captain's head, and he also couldn't be sure that the captain had the full impression of the situation. In fact, the whole reason the pilot monitoring is tasked with calling out deviations is that he or she have less workload than the pilot flying does, and therefore likely a better overall picture of what's going on. So basically, the lesson here is that it doesn't matter why a first officer doesn't speak up. If he's afraid of the captain or because he thinks the captain is handling the situation, it's poor crew resource management either way, and the consequences will end up being the exact same. As it turned out in this situation, the captain wasn't handling it at all. And to understand why, we need to look at what he was actually focused on during the descent and the minutes leading up to it. Now, one way to conceptualize his decision-making is by identifying what it was that made him feel so comfortable that he could make it despite evidence of the contrary. And what seems to have happened here was that every time that he needed to make a decision, some small thing happened that rewarded his choice to continue. Like I mentioned before, at first the crew had expected to land on the less familiar runway 33, but then the wind had died down and the runway was changed over to 08, which in the mind of the pilots made things much easier. Next, they descended out of the clouds and caught sight of both the runway and the airplane ahead of them, allowing the pilots to quickly assess that they could make a visual approach. Then, during the final descent, when the captain noticed that he needed to use an abnormally steep descent rate, he realized that there was a 20-knot tailwind at altitude, causing them to move faster. So he concluded that this problem could be solved by quickly descending to a lower altitude, where the reported tailwind was much lower. Having decided that, he then visually assessed their position relative to the runway and concluded that the picture looked relatively normal to him. Yes, they were definitely a bit high and fast, but he had probably been high and fast on this approach before, and he had always landed without any problems. But what the captain obviously didn't consider was that at their current airspeed and with their high gross weight, the energy state of the aircraft was now super high, even though the view of the runway ahead, in his opinion at least, didn't look that bad. He also didn't consider that he was about to try to land this heavy, fast-moving aircraft onto a relatively short runway, only about 6,000 feet, which was still wet from the recent rain that had recently passed, and which also had absolutely no safety margin at the far end. Just a blast fence and then the city. This is actually a perfect example of why it can be so dangerous to normalize risky behavior and routinely disregard warnings. Because when the sink rate caution sounded, they also failed to bring him out of his complacency because he was using a high sink rate on purpose to get out of the tailwind and regain the flight path. And if we're being totally honest here, he probably had heard sink rate alarms before, again, given the frequent use of steep visual approaches. So by this point, having convinced himself that he actually was in a position to land, his main concern now became the spacing between his aircraft and the other Southwest flight ahead of them. You see, they had slowed down in a normal manner, so Flight 1455 was now starting to catch up with them due to their high speed. And that concerned the captain a bit, since it looked like the slower flight might not be able to clear the runway in time for him to land. That distraction just added to his loss of situational awareness here, where no matter how good he thought that the visual picture was, he just didn't appreciate that the real problem he was now facing was his own aircraft's high kinetic energy and the lack of runway ahead of them. Now, Southwest 737s were equipped with an onboard performance computer capable of calculating their landing distance given certain parameters. And Southwest standard operating procedures called for the pilots to use that computer whenever the performance capabilities of the aircraft were in question, like when landing on a short runway with tailwind or landing with high gross weights, all of which were present here. But because they were convinced that this was just another normal approach in Burbank, neither of the pilots seemed to have considered using this computer to calculate their proper landing distance. If they would have done so, they would have seen just how tight the landing distance actually was, even with the correct approach speed, and the danger that they were now in would maybe have become a little bit more apparent. But without that information, yet another hole in the slices of the Swiss cheese model had now opened up. Anyway, immediately after the captain had called for flaps 40, the first officer pointed to the airspeed indicator to remind the captain that the flaps would be inhibited, but he still didn't call out their actual airspeed or any reservations about what was happening. He then also responded to the captain's call for the final descent checklist by visually verifying the required items, even though this was supposed to be a challenge and response checklist requiring both pilots to participate. Now, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel like you have to do this, where the other pilot is too busy to take part in the checklist, that's a clear indication that the workload is now so high that you need to do something. Likely go around. As the GPWS kept calling out sink rate in the background, the first officer now verified that they were clear to land and also notified the flight attendants to get seated for landing. Moments later, the sink rate caution were now also joined by an even more serious warning.
Pull up!
Now today, we pilots are taught to respond to this warning by immediately executing a terrain escape maneuver, regardless of whether we have the runway in sight or not. But at Southwest Airlines and many other airlines at that time, pilots were instead taught that if they were flying in visual conditions with the runway clearly in sight, and it was possible to verify with complete confidence that there was no threat of collision with the terrain, well then this warning could potentially be disregarded. Now that mindset is, in my opinion, quite strange, because unless the possibility of a false GPWS alert is mentioned in an airport briefing or in a chart, then hearing this warning means that something is definitely seriously wrong, regardless of whether the runway is visible or not. In this particular case, Flight 1455 was now descending so fast that the plane sensed that it was outside the normal approach envelope. So the GPWS believed that the flight path was leading towards a ground collision rather than a landing. Later, the captain said that he never heard the pull-up callouts at all, which I guess could be possible because of the stress that he was experiencing. But the first officer said that he did hear them, but believed that the flight path was safe and that the captain was correcting. Again, a very, very strange thing to hear from a competent pilot monitoring. It would actually have been quite interesting to hear exactly at what point this first officer would have thought it was appropriate to intervene. Anyway, as the warnings continued to blare, Flight 1455 blasted through the stabilization gate at 500 feet without a word from either of the pilots. The plane was now descending at more than 1,000 feet per minute with an airspeed 50 knots above the approach reference speed and with the flaps still not extended to the landing configuration. The captain later also acknowledged that he should have performed a go-around at this point, but explained that he became fixated on the runway. And this kind of fixation or tunnel vision can arise when we're working hard to achieve a concrete visible goal, especially if that goal is challenging to achieve. This is actually known as get-there-itis in the industry, and it's especially common among captains, and this is why we really need a strong, assertive first officer to snap us out of it. But that obviously wasn't happening here. Meanwhile, up ahead of them, Flight 1713 had now cleared the runway, removing what the captain perceived as the last obstacle in his way. The GPWS continued to sound numerous times as they streaked towards the runway, but the captain just said, "That's all right," and the first officer said nothing at all. At a height of 170 feet, the captain started raising the nose to flare for touchdown. And just to give you some reference, we normally flare at around 25 to 30 feet. And 9 seconds after he had started to flare, they touched down on runway 08 at the incredible speed of 182 knots. Now, due to the high speed and steep approach, the touchdown occurred 2,150 feet beyond the threshold, which is well outside the normal touchdown zone located between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. Immediately upon touchdown, the captain activated the thrust reversers, and then he began manual braking much earlier than he would normally in order to help the plane to start accelerating as quickly as possible. But calculations later show that with the prevailing runway conditions, weight and speed, even with maximum manual braking, it would have taken 4,700 feet to bring the speeding plane down to a stop. And they only had 4,150 feet of runway left. This meant that from the moment the captain selected reverse thrust, any possibility of a go-around went out the window, and a crash became inevitable. As the 737 began to decelerate, the flaps finally extended to 40 degrees, but it was now too late to make any real difference. Onlookers at Burbank's nearby passenger terminal watched in horror as the plane hurtled past, clearly moving way too fast to be able to stop within the remaining runway. In the cockpit, the two pilots had now noticed that they weren't slowing down fast enough, and their nonchalance now finally turned into concern, followed by cold, raw fear. The captain now clearly realized what was about to happen and could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder cursing at himself in third person. And he did have good reasons for doing that, because beyond the end of runway 08, there wasn't a long grassy clearway like on other runways. No, instead, there were just 32 feet of open concrete, followed by a solid blast wall designed to deflect jet blasts away from the traffic on North Hollywood Way, which runs directly past the threshold of runway 26. When the captain saw this wall rapidly approaching, he used his nose wheel tiller to steer to the right, aiming across the ramp and towards the open airport fence to avoid a collision with the blast wall. But using the tiller in this way while braking just put the airplane into a skid, which reduced the brake effectiveness even further. So at time 18, 11 and 20 seconds, Flight 1455 clipped the right edge of the blast wall and then careened through the perimeter fence at a speed of 32 knots or 60 kilometers per hour. The nose gear collapsed as the plane then slid across 7 traffic lanes on North Hollywood Way, where it collided with one car and then sent debris flying into several others. And on the opposite side of the street was something taken straight out of a nightmare: a petrol station, dead ahead. For a split second, it seemed as though Flight 1455 would end up in a deadly fireball. But then, the 737 miraculously came to a stop, right on the edge of the petrol station's parking lot, underneath the big sign advertising the price per gallon. A picture that I'm sure that many of you have actually seen. The aircraft was substantially damaged, but the cabin and cockpit were intact, and all passengers and crew had miraculously survived the crash. On the nearby road, several cars had been damaged in the crash, but incredibly, none of their occupants were seriously hurt either. Inside the cockpit, the captain must have now felt a wave of clarity wash over him as he emerged from his previously fixated state, because he now just said, "My fault," and he then added, "Well, there goes my career." Back in the cabin, the R1 escape slide had inflated inside of the galley area during the crash and was now blocking access to the forward exit doors. But fortunately, the passengers had been able to evacuate through the rear and overwing exits. If there would have been a fire, this would have been a serious problem, but thankfully there was none. So in the end, all 137 passengers and 5 crew members evacuated safely, with only 2 passengers suffering serious injuries, while 41 passengers and the captains sustained minor injuries. In the aftermath of the accident, the Federal Aviation Administration suspended both pilots' licenses for 1 year, and as the captain had predicted, both of them were then also fired from Southwest Airlines. The NTSB found that the cause of the accident was the flight crew's failure to go around at the stabilization gate despite excessive speed and a steep flight path angle, which then resulted in a touchdown with insufficient runway remaining to stop the aircraft. The controller's use of speed and altitude restrictions that unnecessarily put Flight 1455 into a position from which a safe approach could not be made was found to have also contributed to the accident. Later, that independent review that I mentioned, commissioned by the Airline Pilots Association, found widespread cultural problems at Southwest Airlines that encouraged pilots to attempt risky approaches without taking due care. In fact, in 2005, another Southwest Airlines flight overran the runway at Chicago's Midway Airport and slid onto a street. And in that accident, which I actually covered on this channel a while back, the flight crew decided to land at Midway, despite very unfavorable conditions due to a perceived pressure to complete the task. After each accident, Southwest implemented reforms to its procedures and training in order to improve its safety culture, and these types of incidents have since become much less common. Thankfully, there was no loss of life in this accident, but it shouldn't be forgotten that if the plane had touched down just a little bit further along or a little bit faster, it might have plowed into that petrol station with catastrophic results. That's why, after this accident, Burbank Airport actually bought the petrol station and another nearby business and replaced them with empty lots in order to prevent that scenario from ever occurring. The airport also equipped the departure end of runway 08 with an engineered materials arrestor system, or EMAS, which stops runaway aircraft using specially engineered gravel underneath a breakable surface. And in 2018, this very EMAS installation stopped another Southwest flight from running off Burbank's runway 08, proving just how valuable these systems are in airports where no proper clear way is possible. Isn't it awesome to see safety work in action? Anyway, I am just back from my amazing holiday in Sweden now, and it was made possible in part by my Patreon crew, who through their support have enabled me to build a much bigger team, able to bridge holidays without loss of production for the first time ever in this channel's history. And if you want to take part in this support and see my next video before everyone else, maybe even today, then use this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot to sign up. I would love to see you there in my next hangout. Remember to also check out the deal from my sponsor in the description and comments below. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.